We begin with the latest developments in the Ukraine crisis after Russian President Vladimir Putin recognized two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine as independent. He also ordered Russian troops to deploy on what he called a peacekeeping operation. The self-declared People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk are home to Russian-backed rebels who have been fighting Ukrainian forces since 2014. Shortly after Mr. Putin's speech, military vehicles were spotted on the outskirts of Donetsk. According to a Reuters witness, no insignia was visible. It was not immediately clear whether this marked the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Earlier in a signing ceremony shown on state television, Mr. Putin described Ukraine as an integral part of Russia's history, and he said he was confident that Russia's citizens supported the decision.
Ситуация на Донбассе вновь приобрела критический, острый характер. И сегодня обращаюсь к вам напрямую, чтобы не только дать оценку происходящему, но и проинформировать вас о принимаемых решениях, о возможных дальнейших шагах на этом направлении. Еще раз подчеркну, что Украина для нас это не просто соседняя страна. Это неотъемлемая часть нашей собственной истории, культуры, духовного пространства.
Global Affairs correspondent Jonathan Eyal joins me now from London. Jonathan, in a televised speech following the move to recognize two breakaway regions in Ukraine, Mr. Putin said Ukraine has no history of being a true nation. What happens now? Does Mr. Putin's speech signal that a larger-scale invasion is the next step?
Well, we will have to wait and see. One of the biggest questions in Europe today is whether the move into the enclaves, the military move into the enclaves by Russia's armed forces is the peak of the crisis or merely the beginning of the crisis. Let us not forget that there is a few unresolved questions about it. First of all, whether the Russian president respects the current borders of the enclaves, because the borders of the enclaves itself within Ukraine are being disputed, and it is quite possible that Russian forces would actually go beyond the enclaves. But secondly, of course, the biggest question is what is the purpose of this exercise? After all, Mr. Putin, as you said, denies the very existence of the Ukrainian nation and claims that Ukraine is an artificial state which should be merged into Russia. If that is the logic, then what we've seen over the last 24 hours is merely the beginning of the fighting, which will continue later. So it's quite possible that Mr. Putin is just trying to provoke Ukraine into responding, which will provide him with a justification for moving to an all-out invasion. This is why the move is exceptionally grave at the moment.
So, that said, how is Ukraine readying itself for a possible war? What is the leadership doing?
Well, effectively, they're doing two things. First of all, they're trying to mobilize all the armed forces of Ukraine and train the civilian population for what effectively would be guerrilla warfare. The comparisons between the two countries just don't stand up. There's no way Ukraine, despite being one of Europe's largest states, can stand up to Russia and the Russian military. So all that the Ukrainians can do is to persuade the Russians, to deter the Russians by telling them that the invasion will be costly. But I think a much more important element for the leadership of Ukraine is to remain in step with other Western governments, to keep the coalition of Western governments that is supporting Ukraine at the moment, not to fall in for the trap that the Russians are very often laying, the provocations that are there just in order to justify the beginning of a war. It's getting increasingly difficult for President Zelensky of Ukraine to go along with that kind of calm policy when you have a neighbor that keeps on biting a territory off your own lands. So this is going to be the long game, and the Ukrainians know that they're in the long game. As President Zelensky keeps on saying, They've been at it for 8 years in one shape or another. It is us in Western Europe who are now suddenly paying more attention to their plight.
Let's talk about the other European countries, France and Germany spearheading diplomacy talks. Jonathan, is there still hope for a breakthrough there? Can war be averted?
Well, I think it's very, very unlikely that diplomacy has much of a chance. Let us not forget that a lot of the diplomatic initiative was based on the precisely discussions between the Russians and the Ukrainians over the future of the enclaves. Now, President Putin of Russia has now removed that question from the table by recognizing these republics as independent. So the entire diplomatic framework that existed and was put in place is no longer available. But just important, that's really worth remembering, is that Putin's moves have taken place just in a few days before the Russian and American foreign ministers were due to meet in Geneva in Switzerland. And just as there was a discussion about the summit between President Biden of the United States and the Russian president. So the indications are that the Russian leadership is not particularly interested in spending time in diplomatic negotiations and believes it can achieve much more with boots on the ground.
Jonathan, thank you for your inputs. Jonathan Eyal there, Global Affairs Correspondent for the Straits Times.